Alright, so I've had this idea to record myself writing a prompt and talk about it after the fact. There's a few artists I follow who do time lapses of their drawing or sketching or something, and I thought I'd try the same thing for writing. So I'm just looking through writing prompts here, looking at stuff that's rising, so getting some upvotes. I don't like many of these prompts. You can see I was looking at this for quite a while because I'm pretty picky about prompts that I'm interested in, I guess. I think a lot of the prompts on writing prompts are fairly formulaic, or they sort of lean on some kind of established story or universe. So here you can see I'm settling on this one. In the far future, humans established colonies on a moon of a planet with civilizations at the technological age equivalent to... Oh, I didn't read it in time. Anyway, the idea is that the moon has humans land on it and develop it, and the planet that moon is going around has Bronze Age people, sort of undeveloped people who are watching the moon develop. So I picked that because I had like a little seed of an idea there, and you can see I wrote my idea at the top there. Bad astronaut rules over the Bronze Ages, that's meant to say. Then good astronaut comes down and saves them. So that's what I started with. I actually didn't end up I didn't end up with exactly that, as we'll see. More or less that. The story doesn't cover the actual saving. It's kind of like the beginning of a history. And sometimes I like writing things like that, like they're just the beginning of a story, or a sort of preface or prologue to a story. It kind of makes you wonder where the story will go. I think that works quite well for a prompt. I don't aim for a specific word count, really. I just I tend to have a feel for how much I want to say, and I think it typically ends up around between 500 and 1,000 words or something. I'm actually not sure how many words this ended up as. So you can see I started off with, they say the king came from the moon. And that's my initial premise. And I'm just building off that. So the idea being that there are these moon people and then there's earth people. Whenever I'm excuse me, whenever I'm pausing, obviously a lot of writing is just sort of pausing to think. This is sped up about 3 times, by the way. Obviously I'm not writing this fast. This took me about an hour. An hour in total, which is I think that's about how long a prompt typically takes me when I'm not just dashing it off. Yeah, and you can see when I'm pausing for a while, I'm just sort of thinking up various things. So here I'm thinking of a name, and I came up with 6 hills for the name of this region. I actually changed that later. So yeah, the idea here is that this Moon King comes to this rural land and starts ruling, but then things slowly... Well, I don't know if I'm sort of feeling out the ideas as I come up with them here, so I don't know if I've had this idea yet, but what will happen is that the king slowly turns bad over time. And the way I'm writing it, I'm going for this sort of mythic-ish storytelling, you know, stories arose that the gods had returned in the east. Like fairly highly written. As in, well, do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like the kind of language that would be used in the mythic story or something. So you can see I changed the name there to Seven Rise, which I wanted to keep the idea of, you know, a number of hills like Rome. Rome had 7 hills. So Seven Rise I thought sounded nice enough. I quite like the idea of hinting at a larger world, even within a small story. This isn't really because of the framing of this story is starts off somewhat omniscient, but you'll see at the end. Then later, I zoom in to be this particular character who was there at the time that he's talking about, or she. Actually, I don't know if I specified that it's a man. You can see I'm making small edits to the language above. I think in general I tend to be switching up between writing new sentences and sort of rereading the rest to get a feel for it. And sometimes when I write something, I'm aware that it's a little bit off or that I might want to change it later, and I sort of float back to it a few times. You can see I'm writing pretty non-linearly here, except now I'm back to the end again. So I sort of scan through it and check that it makes sense. So there, when I added that and when the king arrived bit, I realized that when I had this was before the moon turned bright paragraph, I realized that the previous paragraph, the first paragraph, well, second I guess, starts with, in the early days of his rule, not much was different, i.e. when the king was already ruling, not much had changed. And then I sort of go a bit further back in time. So actually, this is a bit clumsy. I think the opening of this is a bit clumsy. If I spent a bit more time on it, I'd neaten it up a bit, because normally you want your passage of time to be very understandable. So you want to know, is the king ruling now when you're talking about, or are we talking about before the king arrived? And this is hopping back and forth a little bit. I think overall it works, but I kind of fudged it a bit in the end to make it make sense. So here's the idea that when other strange entities arrive on the planet, so the gods in the east, the king starts acting up a little bit. So he's tugging at people's cheeks and not eating food. So at this point in writing, I've got a pretty good idea of the world, even though I didn't start with an idea of the world, really. So typically when I'm writing sci-fi and fantasy, I do start out with creating the world, like world building in a pretty developed way. But for a prompt, you can kind of do that on the fly and sort of expand it as you write into it, and sort of hint at this larger world, because nothing needs to be laid down. Like, I'm never going to be writing in this world again, so you can you can be very loose about it. So as I've been writing this, the picture in my mind has developed of the world, and like a few extra ideas I can put in. Like, I don't actually end up describing the surroundings that much in this. That said, it's more of a tone piece. Like, the idea is when the king starts getting paranoid and mad, that the Seven Rise becomes more and more sort of grim. But in my head, I can imagine what the town or city looks like and what the king looks like. So again, here's something where I don't know if I was writing this again, or if this was part of a longer piece, like a more serious piece. I'd probably spend longer on talking about this change. Like, it's quite a good opportunity to exercise some, you can write some interesting prose about a king slowly turning paranoid and his court slowly turning paranoid and mad. but I did this quite quickly. Okay, it all happens in a paragraph. Really, this could be a whole, well, half a chapter or something. It could be a lot longer, spent on watching a king slowly turn crazy. I had this idea here. There was a long pause there because I had this idea. See, I put crops and flowers, and I quite like the visual of that Seven Rise used to have all these flower fields, and I was thinking if I could incorporate that for a while. Yeah, I was thinking, oh, should I rewrite bits to say Seven Rise is famous for growing flowers or something like that? So the idea being that so these walls were built around the city, and the idea that walls were built on flower fields I thought was quite nice. So I left the flowers in there. I didn't go back and rewrite anything, but again, if I had more time, maybe I'd develop that idea a bit more. The idea that it was not only just a rural, insular place, but that it was actually, you know, growing flowers. So quite a kind of optimistic, happy place. And then it gets turned into this fortress. I think that's quite interesting. So here I actually had the idea that the people change as well, which initially I was just thinking it's the king, and then I realised, oh, actually, the king's change should change the whole. It sort of curdles the whole of Seven Rise, and the protagonist, the narrator in this case, is watching this happen. And this is where it switches to first person. So we know that this narrator was actually involved. He says, if I had been older, I would have left before the war was finished, but I was too young. So we know. So that's a really quick way to sketch the narrator in. It's a long time to wait. To be honest, maybe it works for a short story like this, but generally you don't want to wait so long before you establish who your narrator actually is, if it matters. If it's not just omniscient. I think it works okay here, though. And I've just been developing the idea that the people of Seven Rise have turned evil. Or, if not evil, not good. Well, evil. They're killing each other, so that's pretty bad. Thinking about this now, if I was going back to it, maybe I'd make it a little more supernatural or spooky or alien or something. I think there's ways to put in a few more indicators of that. Obviously the king is supposed to be from the moon. That's the first line. Although in the prompt, I realised later when I read it that the moon people are humans, and the planet maybe isn't humans. At least that's what you can pick up from the prompt itself. I've left it kind of ambiguous as to what species anyone is, and I quite like doing that. But I didn't really establish the king as especially alien either, which could be an interesting thing to do. I think this paragraph is not great, personally. I think I do a bit too much too quickly, where the narrator realises that the king is from the moon and is sort of this renegade or refugee or something. Refugee is the wrong word because obviously he became a king, but some kind of escapee from the moon people. And here I'm just I'm ready to wrap it up. I'm like, this is probably about long enough. So remembering my initial sketch that there's going to be a bad guy from the moon and then a good guy from the moon. I thought I'd end it with the promise of this other alien or human or whatever it is landing from the moon, who maybe will be rebelling against the king, or leading some kind of rebellion against the king. But I think it's done a little quickly. If this was going to be an actual story, let's say the story covered 7 rise, and then how the people turned evil under the king, and then this person landing and following that person landing. I've sort of spoiled it a bit here, by the way, but yeah, the thing that comes from the moon is another guy. So yeah, in a longer story, could cover. You could take a lot more time to develop these things, I think, and then follow. Obviously, it wouldn't end with this person landing. It would probably be about a third of the way in or something. So here you go, young man stepped out, there he is. So there's a bit of description here, like that's probably some of the most description in the piece. I haven't really described 7 rise that much. Which again is something, if I was to go back and do this, probably spend a bit of time doing that. Yeah. Young man's talking in another language, because he's an alien. And he's got some kind of electronic device, which the narrator doesn't recognize as a piece of technology necessarily. And it's got the face of the king on it. So that's the, bringing it all to a close. So I'm pretty happy here. I think I had a couple more lines. I'm just reading through it now. I guess I sort of scan through the whole piece and maybe read little lines here and there and try and get a feel for the whole thing. In general, with a prompt, I'm not gonna go back and do a big rewrite. Like, the first draft is the final draft for a prompt like this. Again, if this was a sort of starting point for a longer story, I would probably put some markers in to say bits that I want to expand to be a lot longer. But yeah, there we go. There's a prompt by me that took about an hour, like I said. Might do some more of these with voiceover. I don't know if it works. You can tell me what you think about seeing a time lapse of me writing a prompt. I don't know if that's interesting, but I thought I'd give it a go. Alright. Thanks for watching.